A child's agonizing scream shattered the midnight silence of the Costello estate. When Nurse Fiona rushed in, blood stained the boy's sheets. Following her instincts, she grabbed her trauma shears and sliced open his customized orthopedic pillow. Dozens of rusted, contaminated needles spilled out. The monster was inside the house. Fiona Jenkins was a veteran pediatric trauma nurse at Chicago's Northwestern Memorial Hospital. At 28, she had seen enough tragedy, abuse, and accidental horror to harden her heart to the cruelties of the world. But she had never encountered anything like the Costello family. It started on a torrential Tuesday evening. Fiona had just finished a grueling 14-hour shift when she was approached in the hospital parking garage by two men in impeccable charcoal suits. They didn't threaten her. They simply handed her a thick, cream-colored envelope and opened the door to a black SUV. Inside the envelope was a cashier's check for $50,000 and a heavily redacted, non-disclosure agreement. It was an advance for 1 month of private, round-the-clock care. Against her better judgment, she got into the car. An hour later, Fiona found herself standing in the cavernous, marble-floored foyer of a fortress-like mansion in Highland Park. The estate belonged to Dominic Costello, a notoriously ruthless businessman whose logistics company was an open secret in Chicago. Everyone knew Dominic controlled the Port Authority, the underground gambling syndicates, and half the politicians in the state. He was a man spoken of in terrified whispers. When Dominic finally walked into the study to meet her, Fiona felt the air leave the room. He was a devastatingly handsome man in his late 30s, standing over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders, honed by a life of violence and discipline. His dark hair was perfectly styled, but it was his eyes, a piercing, icy blue, that commanded total obedience. Yet beneath his lethal exterior, Fiona detected a raw, bleeding desperation. "Miss Jenkins." Dominic's voice was a low, gravelly baritone that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. "I've read your file. You don't back down from difficult cases, you don't ask the wrong questions, and you are the best at keeping children alive." "I am a nurse, Mr. Costello, not a miracle worker," Fiona replied, keeping her voice perfectly steady despite the intimidating proximity of the mob boss. She refused to lower her gaze, a defiance that caused a fleeting, dangerous smirk to touch the corner of his lips. "I don't need a miracle. I need someone I can trust," Dominic said, stepping closer. The scent of expensive bergamot and dark leather wrapped around her. "My son, Arthur. He is 7 years old. For the past 3 months, he has been suffering from severe, unexplained neurological trauma, unbearable pain, sudden spasms, night terrors. The best specialists in the country are baffled. My personal physician is managing his pain, but Arthur is fading." Dominic's voice cracked, just a fraction of an inch, revealing the terrified father beneath the Mafia kingpin. "Save my boy, Fiona, and I will give you anything you desire." Fiona took the job. She moved into the east wing of the sprawling estate the next morning, trading her hospital scrubs for the isolating luxury of a golden cage. Arthur Costello was a sweet, pale boy with his father's striking blue eyes, though his were clouded with exhaustion and fear. He was confined to a massive, custom-built bed in a heavily guarded room. Fiona immediately recognized the signs of severe sleep deprivation and chronic pain, but the medical charts didn't make sense. The estate was a web of tension. Dominic was fiercely protective, often sitting silently in the corner of Arthur's room late at night, watching Fiona work. The simmering, unspoken chemistry between them was undeniable, a dangerous dance between a cynical healer and a lethal criminal. But Dominic was frequently called away on business, leaving the house in the hands of his new wife, Victoria. Victoria Costello was a former socialite, 15 years younger than Dominic. She was cold, impeccably groomed, and openly resentful of Fiona's presence. Victoria insisted that Arthur was merely seeking attention and constantly pushed for heavier sedatives. She was closely allied with Dr. Harrison Reed, the family's private physician. Dr. Reed was a slick, arrogant man who had prescribed Arthur an endless cocktail of muscle relaxants and painkillers, none of which seemed to work. By the second week, Fiona began to notice terrifying patterns. Arthur's pain wasn't constant, it was episodic, and it only ever happened in his bed. "The Sandman bites me, Fiona," little Arthur whispered one evening, clutching her hand with trembling fingers. His eyes darted to his expensive, custom-molded orthopedic pillow, a gift from Dr. Reed, designed to correct the boy's spinal alignment. "What do you mean, sweetie?" Fiona asked softly, brushing the damp hair from his forehead. "When I go to sleep, the Sandman hides in the dark and bites my neck. It burns. It burns so bad." Fiona meticulously examined Arthur's neck and scalp. There were tiny, almost microscopic red marks at the base of his hairline, obscured by his thick, dark hair. Dr. Reed had dismissed them as a mild allergic reaction to his laundry detergent, but Fiona knew better. They looked like puncture wounds. When she brought her concerns to Victoria, the woman laughed cruelly. "You're a glorified babysitter, Fiona. Stop trying to play doctor. Harrison knows what he's doing." But Fiona's instincts, honed in the emergency room, were screaming that Arthur wasn't dying of a disease. He was being slowly, methodically murdered. It was week 3 of Fiona's contract. Dominic had been forced to travel to New York to handle a violent dispute with a rival syndicate, leaving the Highland Park estate under the watchful eye of his heavily armed guards. A severe thunderstorm was rolling off Lake Michigan, battering the mansion's reinforced windows with sheets of rain. The power grid flickered, plunging the sprawling hallways into intermittent, eerie darkness. The tension in the house was suffocating. Earlier that evening, Victoria had practically forced her way into Arthur's room, demanding Fiona administer a double dose of a new, highly potent liquid sedative Dr. Reed had dropped off. "He needs to sleep through the storm," Victoria had ordered, her eyes flashing with impatient malice. "This dosage is enough to suppress his respiratory drive," Fiona countered, standing firmly between Victoria and the boy's bed. "I am not giving it to him. If you have a problem with my medical ethics, you can call Dominic right now." At the mention of her husband's name, Victoria's face tightened into a mask of pure hatred. "You are overstepping your bounds, nurse," she hissed, turning on her heel and storming out. Fiona locked the heavy oak door behind her. She poured the sedative down the bathroom sink and gave Arthur a mild, safe dose of children's pain reliever instead. She sat in the velvet armchair beside his bed, the glow of a small brass reading lamp casting long shadows across the room. Outside, thunder shook the foundations of the house. At exactly 2:14 a.m. it happened. Arthur's body went rigid. His eyes snapped open, wide and unseeing, and he unleashed a blood-curdling scream that tore through the quiet room. It wasn't the cry of a child having a nightmare. It was a visceral, guttural shriek of absolute, blinding agony. "Arthur!" Fiona vaulted out of her chair. The boy was thrashing violently, his small hands clawing desperately at the back of his neck. Tears streamed down his pale face, and his breath hitched in frantic, panicked gasps. Fiona pinned his shoulders down to keep him from hurting himself, her professional training kicking into overdrive. "I've got you, Arthur. Look at me." As she gently turned his head to check his airway, a stark smear of crimson caught her eye. Blood was pooling on the pristine white fabric of his expensive orthopedic pillow. Fiona pulled the boy up, pressing a piece of gauze to the base of his neck. There were 3 fresh, bleeding puncture marks. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she looked down at the bed. There were no insects. There were no loose springs. She reached out and placed her hand flat on the dense memory foam of the custom pillow. It felt perfectly normal, soft, yielding. But then, she pressed harder. She put her entire body weight into her hands, mimicking the sustained pressure of a human head resting there for several hours. "Pierce," Fiona gasped, pulling her hand back. A sharp, searing pain shot through the pad of her thumb. A drop of dark blood welled up on her skin. Panic and rage collided in Fiona's chest. She practically threw Arthur to the other side of the massive mattress, away from the bedding. She sprinted to her medical bag, grabbed her heavy-duty trauma shears, and returned to the pillow. With vicious, tearing force, Fiona drove the shears into the center of the fabric. She ripped the expensive casing apart, tearing into the dense layers of polyurethane foam. What she found inside made the blood freeze in her veins. Embedded deep within the core of the foam was a meticulously constructed grid of plastic mesh. Woven into this mesh were dozens of rusted, thick sewing needles. They were positioned facing upwards, but buried just deep enough so that a light touch wouldn't reveal them. Only when a child's head sank deeply into the foam over a period of hours would the needles slowly, agonizingly push through the surface and pierce the skin. But that wasn't the worst part. Fiona brought her penlight closer, her hands shaking violently. The tips of the needles were coated in a thick, dark, gelatinous substance. It smelled faintly of bitter almonds and rotten copper. It was poison. A slow-acting, necrotic neurotoxin designed to enter the bloodstream microdose by microdose, slowly mimicking a degenerative neurological disease, shutting down Arthur's nervous system night after night while causing him unimaginable torture. "Oh my God," Fiona breathed, the sheer psychopathy of the trap overwhelming her. Dr. Reed had provided the pillow. Victoria had ensured Arthur stayed heavily sedated, so he couldn't wake up immediately when the needles pricked him. They were killing Dominic's air, slowly and invisibly, right under the mob boss's nose. Suddenly, the heavy oak door to the bedroom rattled. Fiona froze. She had locked the deadbolt. Through the roaring thunder outside, Fiona heard the distinct sound of a key sliding into the lock. The brass handle slowly, deliberately pressed downward. Someone hadn't come because they heard Arthur scream. They were coming because they were waiting for him to die. Fiona snatched a heavy bronze lamp from the bedside table, her eyes locked on the turning door handle, ready to protect the boy of the man she was dangerously falling in love with. The door clicked open, and lightning illuminated the silhouette standing in the threshold. The heavy oak door swung open, and lightning flashed through the hallway windows, illuminating the gaunt, sharply angled face of Dr. Harrison Reed. He wasn't holding a medical bag. In his right hand, gripped with lethal intent, was a syringe filled with a cloudy amber liquid. "I heard him scream," Reed said, his voice a smooth, oily whisper. His eyes darted to the bed, expecting to see a heavily sedated child and a complacent nurse. Instead, he saw Fiona standing in the center of the room, her chest heaving, gripping the heavy bronze base of a bedside lamp like a baseball bat. Reed's gaze dropped to the shredded orthopedic pillow on the floor, the rusted, poison-laced needles glinting in the ambient light. The smug, arrogant mask melted off his face, replaced by a cold, calculating panic. "You shouldn't have dug so deep, Fiona," Reed hissed, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him with a soft click. "You're a brilliant trauma nurse, I'll give you that. But you have no idea the forces you are dealing with. Put the lamp down. I can make this painless for both of you." "You're poisoning a 7-year-old boy," Fiona spat, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with an absolute, overwhelming rage. "You swore an oath, Harrison. You're a monster." "I am a pragmatist," he replied, lunging forward with shocking speed, the needle aimed straight for Fiona's neck. But Fiona's years in the emergency room had given her razor-sharp reflexes. She didn't retreat. She pivoted, using the momentum of his lunge against him. She swung the heavy bronze lamp with every ounce of strength in her body. The metal connected with the side of Reed's skull with a sickening crack. The doctor's eyes rolled back, and he crumpled to the Persian rug like a puppet with its strings cut, the syringe skittering uselessly across the hardwood floor. Fiona didn't waste a single second. She dropped the lamp, rushed to the bed, and scooped Arthur into her arms. The boy was whimpering, his small body burning with a low-grade fever from the neurotoxin entering his bloodstream. "Shh, Arthur. Look at me," Fiona whispered fiercely, pressing her forehead against his. "We are going to play a game. A very quiet game of hide-and-seek. You cannot make a sound, do you understand? No matter what happens." Arthur, terrified but trusting the only person who had ever truly comforted him, gave a weak, jerky nod. Fiona grabbed her emergency medical kit, slung it over her shoulder, and wrapped Arthur tightly in a dark woolen blanket to conceal his white pajamas. She cracked the bedroom door open. The corridor was bathed in intermittent darkness as the storm raged outside, the backup generators humming a low mechanical drone. Fiona knew she couldn't trust the estate's security. If Dr. Reed was brazen enough to come to the room, Victoria had likely bought off the night shift guards. Fiona moved with silent, breathless precision. She bypassed the grand staircase, knowing it would be heavily watched, and slipped into the narrow, unlit servants' corridors that wound through the bones of the sprawling Highland Park mansion. As they descended toward the ground floor, the sound of staccato footsteps echoed off the marble below. Fiona pressed herself and Arthur into a shallow alcove behind a velvet drapery. Below them, standing in the grand foyer, was Victoria Costello. She was fully dressed in a tailored silk pantsuit, completely untouched by the late hour. Beside her stood two hulking security guards with drawn tactical weapons. "Dr. Reed isn't answering his radio," Victoria barked, her cultured voice cracking with genuine frustration. "Go upstairs. If the nurse is in the way, eliminate her. Bring me the boy. I want this finished tonight before Dominic gets back from New York." Fiona's blood ran cold. It wasn't just a slow poisoning anymore. Victoria was accelerating the timeline. They were going to slaughter Arthur tonight and stage it as a tragic medical event. Fiona waited until the guards rushed past the servants' stairwell, then slipped down the remaining steps, heading deeper into the mansion. She navigated the labyrinthine basement, finally locking herself and Arthur inside a climate-controlled wine cellar. The thick, reinforced steel door offered a temporary sanctuary. Setting Arthur gently on a crate of vintage Bordeaux, Fiona pulled out her encrypted cell phone. She bypassed the normal security channels and dialed the emergency, direct-to-satellite number Dominic had given her on her first day, a number he claimed was only for life or death. It rang twice before the deep, gravelly voice answered, the background noise indicating he was on the move. "Fiona, report." Dominic's voice was all business, but there was a distinct edge of tension. "Dominic, they are trying to kill him," Fiona whispered frantically, keeping her voice incredibly low. "It's Victoria and Dr. Reed. The orthopedic pillow. Reed lined it with poisoned needles. It's a slow-acting neurotoxin. They're hunting us through the house right now. The guards are compromised." There was a silence on the line, so profound, so terrifyingly absolute, that Fiona thought the call had dropped. When Dominic finally spoke, his voice was no longer that of a concerned father. It was the voice of the ruthless, undisputed king of the Chicago Syndicate, a man who commanded armies of violent men. "Where are you?" Dominic asked, the lethal calm in his tone sending a chill down Fiona's spine. The main wine cellar. Basement level. Barricade the door. Do not open it for anyone, not even the police. Dominic paused, and she could hear the deafening roar of jet engines in the background. I am not in New York, Fiona. My meeting ended early. I am 10 minutes away in a helicopter. Keep my son breathing. I will bring the house down upon them. Hurry! Fiona choked out, her professional composure finally slipping. Fiona. Dominic's voice softened, just for a fraction of a second, revealing the burning intensity beneath. If you protect my boy tonight, I swear on my life, no one will ever touch you again. The line went dead. Fiona immediately turned her attention to Arthur. The poison was taking its toll. His breathing was becoming shallow, his pulse thready. She opened her medical kit. She didn't have the specific antidote. She didn't even know the exact chemical composition of the toxin. But she had high-dose corticosteroids, activated charcoal, and epinephrine to manage his crashing vitals. She worked in the dim light of her phone, starting an IV line in the boy's tiny arm with practiced, steady hands. Stay with me, Arthur. Your dad is coming. He's coming right now. Suddenly, the heavy steel door of the wine cellar rattled. Bang, bang, bang. I know you're in there, Fiona. Victoria's voice drifted through the thick metal, muffled but dripping with venom. There is no way out of the basement. Open the door, and I'll let you walk away. You have my word. It's the boy I want. Not you. Fiona didn't answer. She dragged a massive oak wine rack across the concrete floor, barricading it against the heavy steel door. Have it your way, Victoria yelled. Blow the lock. The deafening blast of a shotgun echoed through the basement, vibrating against the concrete walls of the cellar. The heavy steel door shuddered violently. Fiona threw her body over Arthur, shielding him from any potential shrapnel, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Another blast tore through the locking mechanism. The door groaned, pushed inward, but the heavy oak wine rack Fiona had dragged in front of it held firm, splintering under the pressure. Push it down, Victoria screamed from the corridor. The heavy boots of the compromised guards kicked repeatedly against the steel. The barricade was shifting. Bottles of priceless vintage wine shattered against the stone floor, filling the air with the sharp, acidic stench of alcohol and fermented grapes. Fiona gripped her trauma shears tightly in her right hand, positioning herself in front of Arthur. She was a healer, not a killer, but looking at the pale, shivering boy behind her, she knew she would drive the steel blades straight into the throat of the first man who stepped through that door. "Why are you doing this, Victoria?" Fiona yelled, trying to buy precious seconds. "He is just a child. He's Dominic's blood. That is exactly why he has to die." Victoria's hysterical laughter bled through the gap in the door. Dominic's empire is built on succession. As long as Arthur lives, I am just a trophy wife, an ornament. But if the tragic, sickly heir finally succumbs to his mysterious illness, I become the sole beneficiary of the Costello Trust. Dominic is too blinded by grief to see what Harrison and I have been doing. Once the boy is gone, Dominic will be a broken shell. I will rule this city. "You severely underestimate your husband," Fiona shouted back. "My husband is 1,000 miles away," Victoria sneered. Suddenly, a sound drowned out the roaring thunderstorm outside. It was a deep, rhythmic thudding that rattled the very foundation of the estate. The unmistakable thwack, thwack, thwack of helicopter rotors descending directly onto the front lawn. The kicking at the cellar door abruptly stopped. Through the thick walls, Fiona heard the distant sound of shattering glass, followed by a series of sharp, suppressed gunshots. Puffed, 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 the unmistakable sound of professional, tactical breaching. "What is that?" Victoria's voice panicked. Check the perimeter! Go! Footsteps rushed away from the door. Fiona held her breath, keeping her body positioned over Arthur. For 3 agonizing minutes, the mansion above them transformed into a war zone. The muffled sounds of shouting, breaking furniture, and the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor cascaded down the stairwell. And then, dead silence. A shadow fell over the gap in the broken cellar door. Fiona. It was a voice forged in steel and ice. Dominic. Dominic! Fiona shoved the splintered remains of the wine rack aside. The steel door swung open. Dominic Costello stood in the threshold, completely drenched in rain, his tailored suit ruined. His knuckles were bruised, and a streak of blood, not his own, marred his sharp jawline. Flanking him were 4 heavily armed men dressed in black tactical gear, their faces expressionless. Dominic's icy blue eyes locked onto Fiona, sweeping over her defensive posture and the trauma shears gripped tightly in her hand. Then his gaze fell to Arthur, who was pale but breathing steadily under the blanket, an IV line secured to his arm. The terrifying Mafia boss dropped to his knees on the glass-covered floor. He didn't care about the ruin of his clothes or his lethal image. He pulled Arthur into his arms, burying his face in his son's dark hair. A ragged, tearing sob escaped Dominic's chest. "I've got you, Mayor Piccolo," Dominic whispered fiercely, kissing the boy's forehead. "Daddy's here. The monsters are gone." He looked up at Fiona, his eyes blazing with an intensity that stole her breath. "You kept him alive." "He needs a hospital, Dominic," Fiona said, her voice shaking now that the adrenaline was beginning to crash. "He needs a toxicology screen and a broad-spectrum neuro-flush. Now." Dominic nodded. He stood up, carrying Arthur effortlessly against his chest. "Silvio!" Dominic barked to his lead man. "Bring the private ambulance around to the back. Full medical team on standby." "Yes, boss." As they walked out of the cellar and ascended the grand staircase, Fiona witnessed the aftermath of Dominic's wrath. The corrupted guards were restrained on the floor, bleeding and broken. Dr. Harrison Reed had been dragged from upstairs, conscious but terrified, zip-tied to a marble pillar. And in the center of the foyer, surrounded by Dominic's loyal men, was Victoria. She was on her knees, her silk suit ruined, crying hysterically as she stared up at the husband she had tried to destroy. "Dominic, please," Victoria begged, her voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "It was Harrison. He manipulated me. I love Arthur, I swear it." Dominic stopped. He didn't yell. He didn't strike her. He simply looked down at his wife with a cold, dead emptiness that was infinitely more terrifying than his rage. "You put poisoned needles in my son's bed," Dominic said softly, the silence in the grand foyer amplifying his lethal tone. "You made him scream in the dark." Dominic turned away, shielding Arthur's face. He looked at his lieutenant. "Take them to the warehouse at the docks. Do not make it quick." "Wait, Dominic! No!" Victoria's screams echoed through the mansion as she and Dr. Reed were dragged out into the storm. An hour later, Fiona found herself sitting in the ultra-secure, private VIP wing of Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The floor had been entirely bought out and locked down by Costello's men. Arthur was sleeping peacefully in a massive suite, his vitals stable, the poison actively being flushed from his system by the top toxicologists in the state. Fiona sat in the quiet hallway, staring down at her trembling hands, still covered in dried blood and medical tape. A heavy, warm coat was draped over her shoulders. She looked up to see Dominic standing beside her. He had cleaned up, though the dark circles of exhaustion were evident beneath his striking blue eyes. He sat down next to her on the leather bench, their shoulders brushing. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The doctors said another hour, And the neurological damage would have been permanent, Dominic said quietly, staring straight ahead. You didn't just do your job tonight, Fiona. You fought a war for my son. He's a brave boy, Fiona whispered. He didn't deserve any of this. Dominic turned to her, reaching out gently. His large, calloused fingers brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was shockingly tender, sending a surge of warmth straight to her chest. I live in a world built on lies, betrayal and blood, Dominic murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips before meeting her eyes with burning sincerity. I have never met anyone like you, someone who stands their ground in the dark, someone who protects what is innocent, no matter the cost. Fiona felt her breath hitch. I was just doing what was right. You did the impossible, Dominic corrected softly. He took her hand, his thumb tracing her knuckles. My empire, my wealth, it means nothing without my son. You saved my world tonight, Fiona, and I protect what is mine. He leaned in, the dangerous, intoxicating scent of bergamot and rain washing over her. When his lips met hers, it wasn't a tentative kiss. It was a promise. It was the fierce, undeniable sealing of a bond forged in terror and survival. Fiona surrendered to the heat of it, her hands tangling in his dark hair, knowing that she had stepped out of her quiet life and into the heart of a violent, fiercely loyal king. She was no longer just the nurse. She was the one who held the heart of the Costello Empire in her hands. If Fiona's fierce bravery and this dark Mafia romance kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this thrilling story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more intense, dramatic, real-life inspired tales. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. What would you do in Fiona's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.